Good morning. Great to see everyone with us this morning. Glad you're here, and if you would, bow with me, we'll get started with a word of prayer. Dear God, we are truly thankful for this time, the times that you give us to open up your word and to read from it, and to apply it, and Father, may we stay in your word, and may we keep it as a reminder every day of all the great blessings you give to us. Be with us now as we go through this class. In Christ's name, amen. All right, so we're going to be in Deuteronomy. Finally, Chris and I have had a ongoing kind of a joke. I've give him the same scripture for about a month now, and to put in the bulletin, and finally we're getting there. So Deuteronomy chapters, we're going to say 4 through 6. I think in the bulletin it said 5 and 6, but 4 through 6. And I know that's kind of a strange set of scripture for what we've been talking about, but I think we'll bring it together pretty quick here. All right, so last week was kind of a reboot, and we said that, hey, we're going to tell our story from, in a very quick way, 15, 20 minutes there. I did it from beginning to end, and I told the story of God and His promises to His people, which happens to be us. It's our story that we talked about. And so it reminded us of, all the things that God has done for us up to the point of where we are today in being Christians. And so now when we look back at what we're actually studying, this idea of common ground, finding common ground in what we believe, so that we can share it with others. And so we get back to this idea of, okay, we've got a basic belief in God and of His Word to us through Scripture. And then we look back at His, our story as to where we got to where we are today, and we say, okay, so the things that we believe deal with how God gave His people certain things throughout history. And so after I went over that last week, we go back now, and here we find ourselves in Deuteronomy and finding God's first real written instruction to His people. Okay? So we started with, talking about in the beginning and all the great things that happened there in Genesis that we know we have a common belief with. And once you are basically any Judeo-Christian religion, those basic things that we've been talking about, okay, yeah, we can agree on those, we're good with them. That's not an issue. But then we get into, okay, God has chose Abraham, meaning that everything after Abraham is God's chosen people. We're God's chosen people because Abraham is our father. And from that point on, God starts saying, I'm going to bless these certain people. These are my people that I'm going to raise up. And there are certain things that I expect from my people. So He starts giving them rules and regulations because without them, they were doing a terrible job. He chose Abraham, and He said, "Go and multiply, and your seed will be like the sands of the earth." And they'll go out everywhere, and that's what we are. And so He gave them a lot of liberality, but then they didn't do very well with that when they got to the Tower of Babel, and so He scattered them all. And so now you've got these people everywhere, but you've got God's chosen people through Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob and the children of Israel. So, we remind ourselves that God says, I'm going to lead you back to the promised land. But in this process, in the process of leading you back to the promised land, I'm going to give you a law. Okay? So that's where we are. God's going to give them a law through Moses. And this is the first written law. So when we look at this law, we begin to see the basics of what God expects from His people, from us. Now, we're talking about the children of Israel, but these basic things that God has told them are the same things that He expects from all humanity. In fact, we're going to see in Deuteronomy here, he talks about these basic rules, commandments. They're supposed to be for everyone from the children of Israel to their children, to forever. Okay? So oftentimes when we look back at the Ten Commandments and we see, well, those are old, they don't necessarily apply, or they're not exactly what we want. Well, yes, they are. God gave them as a basic start to how He wanted His people to live. That's no different than today. Now, we have that plus an even higher standard when we become Christians. We're going to talk about that a whole lot more later. But you got to start with something. And God realized that His people, without some kind of written rule, written regulation, they were just going to be off the rails. Mike.
So, the story of Scripture talks about God's relationship to man. And it starts with a man who becomes a family, that becomes a nation. And you can't have a nation without a people, a law, and land. And that's where we are here. You have the people, the Israelites, the law, and then the land, the promise that they're walking into. You have to have geographic border. You have to have a group of people, citizens, and you have to have law. You look at any nation on the planet right now, they have those three things. And so for God to create a nation, which is how the vehicle He's going to use to relate to the entire world,
Forever.
all the way through, He's involved in all the different geopolitical things from now on until Jesus comes. And we still are. We still have to operate that way. You had to have these things, and that's where the law comes in. That's the vehicle He uses to communicate His expectations to the world.
So, extremely well said. So there's this idea of, and I'll repeat that a little bit so everybody can hear this. This idea, if you're going to have an organized nation, you've got to have a people, a law, and a land. And that's what God does. God says, I've got my people, I've got a law, and I'm going to take them back to the promised land. But I've got to give you this law. And that's true, you know. We talk about it, this is God's story, this is our story, but every nation, I mean, if you don't have those things, you're not going to be a nation, right? So, and that's a basic setup for what God's trying to get His people to do here, okay? So, here we are in Exodus 20 or Deuteronomy chapter 5, and God is giving His basic rules to His people. Hey, I'm going to lead you back to the promised land, and here's the rules that you need to live by. So, when we talk about having a common ground and having a basis of what we believe in, these are our people. This is our history. We go back and, okay, this is where the rules started. So, we need to look at these rules to say, yeah, this is what we believe in too. Okay? We do believe in what God gave them. Now, there is, as I said, there's even higher calling for us as Christians, and we're going to get to that later. But we got to start with these basics, because that's what God said. If you're going to be my people, I'm going to have to give you a place to stay and you're going to have to follow what I tell you to do. And he tells them that over and over again, right? As they're wandering through the wilderness, over and over and over again, here's what you need to do. Now, these are very conditional, right? Because God says continually, if you do them, I'm going to bless you. If you keep these rules, I'm going to bless you. And every time they keep them, He blesses them. But when they don't, things don't go well, right? No different than it is for us today. Same thing. We keep His rules, He blesses us. We don't, He doesn't. It's really that simple, okay? And so when we look back at these basic ideas of what really is just common sense rules. We look at the Ten Commandments. They're just common sense rules. But God had to say, I'm going to write them down and give them to you, because if not, then you're going to stray from them extremely quickly. And so that's what He's done.
Today it's a little more complicated than that. Then if they kept His rules, He blessed it. If we're keeping His rules, then He will bless us today. There's a problem. I mean, we need to be keeping His rules because He has blessed us.
Yeah. So, and that is just the way you stated that there is one of the big reasons for the coming of Christ. Because of the blessing that we have. Not because He's going to bless us, because He has blessed us. And that's a great point. This idea of being a blessed people, we can't take that for granted. And we've got to own it too, and that's why I keep saying this is our story. This is our history here. We need to own that history. We need to make sure people know it, and we need to share it with others. I mean, I said this last week, and I think it's important. When somebody says, "Hey, who are you?" and we start telling our lineage and telling our parents and all that stuff, we need to be just as ready to share our basic story of being God's people with them. We need to know that, because that's really what we want to share with them. It doesn't, when I'm meeting somebody new, don't get me wrong, it's perfectly fine to talk relationships and who you know. That's great. But what is the end game? The end game is to help to lead them to Christ. And if I'm going to lead them to Christ, I really need to be sharing my Christian story, my relationship with God's story to them, if that's ultimately where I want to go, right? So I need to know it, and that's kind of what we're doing here. We're starting with this, what we believe in this common ground. So when you get to the Ten Commandments, so go ahead. I'm going to go back to chapter 4 just in a minute, because there's a few things in there I want to mention, but most of everything we're going to look at chapter 5. All right, so in Deuteronomy chapter 5, and here's the reason I like Deuteronomy's, the Ten Commandments here in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Most of the time we go to Exodus 20. Deuteronomy 5, I like the Ten Commandments are the same, obviously, they're the Ten Commandments, but what leads up to them and what comes after them in chapter 6, to me, gives you a much better explanation of the why, as Mike was saying. It gives you more of the background than Exodus does. It just reads better in my mind in a lot of ways. But when we look at these Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy, we begin to realize something, that really these Ten Commandments could be 3 commandments, okay? Because there's 3 things that God deals with here. Now, we're going to talk about all of the 10 specifically, and I don't know how far we'll get, but let's look big picture. You know me, I like to look big picture, right? So, but there's 3 things in these 10 commandments that if you get a hold of these, you've got a great start on your walk with God, okay? And so these 3 things are, number 1, God, period. because that's how he starts them, right? There's no other gods but me. Don't start any, don't carve any idols. Don't make any other gods. I'm it, right? And don't take my name in vain. I am the God. Respect that. Okay? So there's this big first idea of I am your God. Number two, there is this idea that I've made my people in my image, in the idea that you're a family. Okay? And I want you to be my people and have a family relationship. Right? Honor your father and your mother. Do not commit adultery. Those are things you do for your family. Okay? So there's God, there's family, and then there's your neighbor. That's it. That pretty much sums up the Ten Commandments. Because when you look at these other ones, this idea of murder, or bearing false witness, and do not steal, do not covet. Those are all relationships you have with your neighbor, right? So we have a relationship with our neighbor, a relationship with our family, and our relationship with God. That's it. So oftentimes, when we look at issues in our life, or really if we go back and look at all the problems that the Israelites had, and the problems that have been ever since, if we would focus on those three things, then they'd probably all go away, right? All those issues would go away. If we think, okay, I got to keep God first, I got to keep my family second, and I got to keep my neighbors, I've got to serve my neighbors the way I'm supposed to and treat them right. And that's what, when you start reading the Ten Commandments, oh, wait a minute. That's really what God's telling them to do. But He's got to tell them. He can't just, He recognizes that with the Israelites people, if He doesn't give them a set of rules, and, He's got His people, if He doesn't give them this set of rules, and He didn't give them a place to live, as Mike was saying, they're not going to make it. That's what you got to have. And so that's what He starts with. And so He starts with this idea of, hey, just keep me first. I've made you this idea of having a family unit. Make sure that's priority, and know how to treat others. Harold, go ahead.
One of those is pretty easy to prioritize, and that's the neighbor. It's pretty easy to keep your neighbor third in line. But for me, and I'm suspecting for a whole lot of us, it is really hard for us to keep God in front of family. I've put family in front of God numerous times.
And the interesting thing about that is they're not separable, but at the same time, you have to make sure which one's in front, right? You can't separate them. You can't say, I'm keeping God first and don't take care of your family. You can't do that, right? But then you're not keeping God first. But you have to be careful with the opposite of that. You can say, yeah, I'm taking care of my family, but I'm leaving God out. That's what does happen to a lot of people. And, you got to keep your priorities there. That's good. Mike?
I don't know how, first I was visiting today, but you talked about Exodus, you talked about Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy means second law. So these are the children of the parents who died in the wilderness. So when Moses gave this law to their parents, they obviously had a hard time keeping it. And now he's having to do it the second time. That's why Deuteronomy's got more of this information you were talking about in it, and it's a great thing to study. You see a lot of God's heart in this. A lot of times we have this idea that in the Old Testament it's just about the law, and that we don't really see God's relationship. But Him even giving this law is is so clear that God wanted them to be his people. He made Leviticus, there's 613 of these laws because he would kill them. If he comes to the tabernacle and they're unholy and he's holy, they're dead.
Yeah.
And so he wants a relationship with him so much that he makes all these ways so that he can dwell with them. And so that's so important, like to understand that concept that God wanted to be with his people. And that's something that I don't think I always understood. But out of that 613 laws, they break down in 10 commandments. And then you said something very interesting to me just right now. Jesus, when he's asked a question, because the Pharisees always wanted to, simplify things and argue, and they said, what's the great commandment? And he says in Matthew 22:37 through 40, the first is love God, the second is love your neighbor. I love the fact, though, when you parse that a little bit more, and that family relationship, I don't know if I've ever heard anybody say that, but I get it. And then, because of what he's saying, that's a hard thing to do, but I can see that in here. There is a distinction between, it's not just God and people, because of the way that physically and spiritually the family is separated out so much. There's a real need for that. So I really do appreciate that and see that as something that we can truly take away from that, especially
So,
even then, but more so now.
yeah, and that's what I found interesting too. When you look at these, he talks about, okay, so these are his people. Let's think simply again. These are God. We are God's people, and God is very specific. I'm it, the only one. Period. Don't bring in anybody else. And we're going to talk about that even more, because he does say multiple times, especially here in Deuteronomy, he's a jealous God. You can't say I'm going to bring in anybody else. That's not the way it works. He is a jealous God. So he makes that point. But here is his first rules to his people. And it's how they need to operate amongst themselves, between them and their neighbor, right? But how important is family to God? That in these 10 rules, he says, honor your father and your mother, and don't commit adultery, which the whole point of that is, well, if one of his commandments is do not commit adultery, then what do you think what priority do we put on our marriages? What priority do we put on that relationship? This is one of his commandments to us, is about how important marriage is, that it's in these commandments. Well, if it's that important that it's in these 10 basic things we need to keep in mind with God, then it must be pretty important. And it is. Okay? So we have this idea. Now, you can even expand that idea of adultery to, from a basic sense of being faithful, but being faithful to God, being faithful to your family, being faithful to your kids. It's a general faithfulness. But the main one that we see, of course, being faithful to your spouse, that's what is trying to be hammered home here. And so, once again, he goes back, through Moses. He's telling us, these are the things you need to really focus on. You keep God right, you keep family right, you keep your relationship with your neighbors right. You've got a real good start in being the people that I want you to being my people. But you've got to do those. You've got to do those. So let's go back to this idea again. Let's remind ourselves, okay, so what are we doing? We are trying to relate to somebody that may not be a Christian or believe something different than we believe. and we're trying to find common ground. So we take these basic relationships and we say, look, do you believe in this? Do you believe that there is one God, and we're not supposed to put anything in front of Him? We're not supposed to create any other idols, no other images, and you can get people to get on board with that. Now, one thing, let's look at some of these a little more specifically now, because I think it's important that we do. Of these 10, I think there are some that people have a lot more struggles with than others in the day and age that we live in. Okay? So that's what we're going to do. We'll never get through them all, but I really want your input on this as we go through these. Okay? And we'll take as long as you want to. I don't care how long it takes, but it's important. You know, when we start with the basics idea of there's no other gods, I'm not saying there's not some struggles with that maybe, but in our realm here, I think we have a pretty good grasp of that. There's one God, He's a jealous God, and we're going to stick with it. Now, I will say this, when you get to the idea that He repeats multiple times, He's a jealous God, and He says it, if you've read, He says it multiple times in all 3 chapters, I believe. But the point is that when we look around the earth, there's a lot of people that may look for other avenues. And you know the children of Israel did that. They said, look, yeah, we believe in you, God, but there's these other people with these other gods, and we want to make sure that we don't anger them, so we're going to accept them too, And the children of Israel did that. Well, here's the thing. In the world we live in today, there's people that believe in other gods, and if you don't be careful, you'll find yourself accepting their belief in other gods. Generally not necessarily a problem with us, but it could be, especially if you look at, if you've done any missionary work and you've gone overseas and you quickly recognize, wait a minute, these people are not like us. They have all these other God influences, little g, influences in their life. We have to be careful with that. So, but most of the people we meet, we're going to see, hey, this is okay. And the whole idea of idols, it depends on how far you want to take that. Obviously you could say that we have a lot of idols in our lives as far as what we make as a priority above God. And that's definitely true. We have to be extremely careful with that and not putting anything ahead of Him. But here's the one I really wanted to get to first, is this idea of not taking the Lord's name in vain. All right, so if you look at Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 11, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes His name in vain. This particular commandment is one that I believe is looked over very easily in today's climate. Okay? And one that should not be looked over. So, I live in the construction world, right? And if you live in the construction world, you get a mixed bag of people. I mean, totally mixed. All different backgrounds, all different relationships. And that's, in some ways, that's a good thing, because it's an ability that you have to reach out to people that maybe you haven't related to before. And maybe you relate to them very well, But when you live in that world, the idea of the words they choose that comes out of their mouth, man, some of them can be pretty rough, right? Now, I'm going to say something you may or may not agree with fully here, but I hear a lot of that stuff when I'm out inspecting or out dealing with contractors or whatever. And most of it doesn't really affect me. I've heard it before, so it just kind of passes by. And I think a lot of it is just, it's words that they use that are, maybe it's just standard vocabulary for them. They don't even recognize it to some extent. However, and like I said, a lot of times it doesn't necessarily offend me that much. But I will say this. There is a big difference in using, and I believe this is very scriptural. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not condoning the use of what we call curse words by any stretch of the imagination. However, from this perspective, there is a huge difference in saying a curse word and taking the Lord's name in vain in a particular way. Okay? So, what does it mean to you to take the Lord's name in vain? It's not saying a particular curse word. This is not what this commandment is about. Now, I'm not condoning that. That's not what this commandment is about. This commandment is about using God's name in vain. What does that mean? I'm sorry? Okay, in a useless way or a way that it's not meant to be used. Meaning, that's very good. And not giving it the respect that it deserves, right? Doesn't that tie in real well with what we just said about God being a jealous God? If we're His people, we have to respect what He tells us. What I'm getting at is if I'm on a job site and I hear, a bunch of words that I don't particularly care for and I'm not going to use, it doesn't bother me that much until, and y'all know what I'm talking about, until they use God's name in vain. They're using God's name in a place that has there's no place for it, right? Used to, I wasn't, I guess, as bold as I am now. I'd let that go. I don't let that go anymore. I make it a point, I try to do it extremely respectfully, but I try to make it a point to tell somebody when they do that, not to do it. And generally, if you'll try to do it very respectfully, they'll say, oh, I apologize. I didn't even know what I said. And they may not have, but I think God is looking down on us and wanting Him to respect His name, His position in the things we do. And if we use His name very flippantly without even knowing, He doesn't like that. Not only does He not like it, He hates it. It's one of His 10 commandments. Don't use His name in vain. So this is kind of a challenge I have for you. If you are, if you're around somebody that does that, find a very respectful way to say, hey, could you not do that?
You mentioned instruction. I love to be around instruction. So I understand what you're saying. I was blessed enough, I made a decent living in the transportation industry. There's another place that you'll hear a lot of words we should be using too, unfortunately. But one thing we found around our office is if you don't use that language, even when some of the roughest drivers, and I'm not classing drivers, I know some great Christian people that are truck drivers. Anyway, when they come around the office, they can bring that kind of conversation in the office.
Exactly.
My point is, if you show the example, people
That's right. So, and you will notice that, and I say that sometimes I'll bring it. It does depend on the situation, obviously, but as Gary said, if you're around a certain group of people long enough and they see you not saying those things, they pick up on that. They know, they recognize. It doesn't take long before they recognize the kind of person you are, and that you're not going to put up with that, or you don't. That's not how you live. So they won't do that to you. They won't put you in that position. And that's what we ought to do. Brad. And you know, Bradley, it's important that, I said construction, but it's in all aspects today, for sure. All aspects. I mean, from what some people think are the whitest collars to the darkest blues, it doesn't matter. It's everywhere. It is everywhere. And if you want a big dose of it, you get on social media. It's all over social media. I mean, everywhere. There's such a disrespect for God in social media. It's ridiculous. But yeah, Chad.
I may be taking this in a different direction.
That's good.
Kind of along these same lines. It bothers me probably more when somebody uses God and explains their relationship with Him for their benefit and never genuinely acts like it. I might think of politicians a little bit when I'm saying this, but also co-workers, that when they're in the right group, when they can bring it up, they can talk about God and maybe lead a prayer and things, but genuinely on their day-to-day, they have filthy language and they don't act like they should. I think that's also using the Lord's name for their own vanity in vain.
That's entirely correct. And I was hoping that would come out, because that was one of the things when you talk about using the Lord's name in vain, it could be in multiple different ways, not just from an idea of cursing, but in an idea of, I'm going to use God to make me look better. And that's what a lot of people do. They'll say, God has done this, God does that, and God has no place in their life. But they're trying to use it to better, their standing in some way or another. And politicians are definitely guilty.
You said that's the way it is in the construction world. That's the way it is in this. We need to be real careful that we don't just justify this is the way it
That's right.
is. And so I don't want to offend these people, or that, you don't, as an inspector, and you go out there to a job, you got the final say. Say, sir, I would appreciate that you didn't use that kind of language around me. And if he did, say, well, I'll be back when we can.
when you can agree to act decent.
I mean,
Yeah.
but we tend to justify, well, that's just the way they do that.
We do, and that's something I've got written down. It's one of these, but hold that thought so I don't forget it later. But it's one of those I believe things. And we're out of time. But it's so oftentimes we give people excuses because we say, well, that's just how they are. Well, that's just the words they use. So, doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but you might put up with what they're saying. No, it's not. It's either way. That's okay. No, you won't. But that's all right.
Harold and I work in his yard all day one day, and we don't get anything done. We, at the end of the day, said, well, all of our effort was in vain. We wasted the day. The Lord is saying, don't waste my name.
Yep.
Don't bring my name into anything that is wasteful now.
And that's exactly, that's a great way to put it. And that's what Chad was saying in that relationship of, you know, how politicians are. They use it as they're wasting it. That's what they're doing.
Don't even speak my name unless you're speaking it with the utmost reverence and take it like, when the scribes, they would wash their hands. They wouldn't even write his name.
They wouldn't.
They were in the right mindset.
Exactly.
Use my name out loud.
To make such a, you know, we have watered that down so much, but yet the respect is what's desired. Well, I mean, once again, I think you have to be careful with that in that it doesn't get to be some kind of just repetition that you say. It's perfectly fine to say, God bless you. Perfectly fine. But let's make sure that we mean it. Right? That we don't use it and just flippantly and it doesn't really mean anything. And we really didn't mean God bless you. It's perfectly fine to say it. Let's make sure that every time we use His name, that the reverence goes with it, as Chad said, that the respect is there. Thank you so much for all your comments. We're going to keep this same thought going, okay, from where we're at for next week. All right, who's got a prayer?